So in this lesson, we're going to look at how multicellularity evolved. It actually evolved several times, okay, in different groups of organisms. We're going to understand the role of specialization. That's going to be a key word, specialization. Specialization is, in fact, what makes a multicellular organism truly multicellular. There are some organisms that are multicellular, but they're not truly multicellular. They're really just a colony of cooperating cells, and that's different. Okay? So specialization is going to be important, and we're going to look at the plant as an example of a multicellular organism with specialization, with specialized cells and tissues. The other thing we're going to look at is how science and religion are not the mortal enemies you think they are in terms of this whole theory of evolution idea. Okay? Because for a very long time, the church and science were at odds over this topic. Okay? They haven't always agreed. But they have agreed actually for quite some time. Right? Pope Francis, who was actually had like a degree in chemistry, believe it or not. Also like philosophy, but chemistry. So he's actually a scientist by nature. Right? One of the first things he did when he became Pope was to come out and explain to people that the church does not actually oppose the idea of the theory of evolution. In fact, it is well supported by the Bible, believe it or not. Okay? So, why does the church agree with the theory of evolution? Okay? And this whole idea that the earth is 4.6 billion years old and that life has had a tenuous hold on this planet for about half of that time. Okay? Why does the church think that's okay as opposed to the idea of creating everything in 6 days? Okay? Because the whole creation story is just that. It's a story. It's what happened, but it's told figuratively, which is how a lot of the Bible is supposed to be interpreted. It's figurative. I mean, Jesus himself spoke in parables. He told stories as a means of teaching. Okay? You have to imagine the time in which Jesus lived and the time in which the gospel writers, okay, and also the people who wrote the Bible, lived. They lived in a time where most people lived a subsistence form of life. That means every minute of every day was spent making sure they could put food on the table. There wasn't time for anything else. There was no internet. Okay? Most people couldn't read. Okay? The vast majority of the population was illiterate because they didn't have time to go to school. As soon as they were old enough, they were helping out their parents to make sure food got put on the table. Okay? That was the lifestyle back then. So if you came about in that time and said, so the story of creation goes like this. About 5 billion years ago, the area we now live in was this cloud of debris that slowly started to contract due to gravitational attraction between masses. And over the course of the next, 500 million years, the rocks and such would collect and form the planets and blah, blah. People would have thrown rocks at you until you were dead. Okay? You would have been stoned, not in the way that commonly means, but actually by being thrown rocks at until you're dead. Okay? Because they would have said that person is possessed, or that person is crazy, or that person is talking against what the church said, or whatever, because people weren't educated. They had no concept of billions of years and planetesimals and gravitational attraction. They didn't know any of that stuff. Okay? And they didn't have time to learn about it or hear about it. So, you want to tell a story of how everything was created? You tell a story. Okay? It's a metaphor. 6 days is a metaphor for several billion years worth of time. But if you follow the creation story, it still follows the order that science says everything happened in. Okay? Let there be light. Big Bang? Got to have been pretty bright. Big explosion created everything? Yeah, I think that was pretty bright. Okay? And even if that's not where the let there be light part came from, okay, the first thing to form in our solar system would have been what? The sun. Yeah, stars would have formed first. They're the biggest thing. Okay? When the sun or the proto-sun got massive enough okay, that its gravitational force caused hydrogen molecules to start fusing to become helium, that would have been bright. That was the ignition of the sun. That would have cast the light that gave essentially energy to all things that would ever live here. Okay, so this creation story still follows all of that. Okay, separating the heavens from the earth, that could be the formation of the earth. Okay, separating the land from the sea, the ocean came after. Okay, it required the water vapor in the air to cool and condense and fall as rain, okay, on this molten ball of rock that was the earth. It all took time. Okay, it didn't take 6 days. It took a lot longer than that. But that was a way to tell the story of the miracle of creation. It's still a miracle, even if it didn't take place over 6 days. Okay? The fact that we're all here and all these things just happen to fall into place the right way for us to exist is still a miracle. Okay? The fact that it took 4.5 billion years doesn't lessen the process or lessen the amazement at how it all worked. Okay? So the church has no problem with saying, yes, Genesis is metaphor, okay, for what really happened and what science says happened. There's no problem with that. Okay? And the same idea goes for the theory of evolution. Okay? The reason the church doesn't have any problem with Darwin's theory of evolution, which involves how an organism or a species may change over time, okay, is that when God created the universe and created Earth specifically, he knew the Earth was not going to be static. Okay? It was going to change, and it was going to change a lot. In fact, he probably had all of those changes planned. And so he knew that there had to be a mechanism for the life he put on this earth to use to adapt to those changes. That mechanism is natural selection, which causes evolutionary changes. Okay? If he just made everything so that it could survive at one point in time on Earth, everything would be dead now. Okay? I mean, there's been a number of mass extinctions that this planet has suffered. Okay? But something always survived. Okay? It adapted, it overcame, okay? It changed and then repopulated. Okay? All of that is a mechanism by which life persists. Okay? Persists and changes, okay, along what God's plan was, eventually to have people here. We're the 6th day. Okay? Man was created on the 6th day. 7th day, God rested. That's why in the Jewish religion, the Sabbath is so important. The Sabbath is actually what day of the week?
Isn't it the evening of Friday to the evening of Saturday?
Yeah, it's Saturday. Yeah. Okay? It's not Sunday. Sunday's like a Christian thing. Okay? So the Sabbath is actually Saturday. So like Saturday's your day you're not supposed to do anything. Sunday you're supposed to go to church. All right. So yeah, that's kind of how all of that works. Okay? That's why, again, the Catholic Church has no problem with the idea of evolution. It supports the idea that Earth has changed and that man eventually came to be. Okay? Because we're supposed to be God's ultimate creation. Okay? The personification of him on earth. That's what we're supposed to be, and we came last. Okay? If you follow everything in the fossil record, yep, we came last. And we're not doing a real great job of taking care of everything, okay, for him like we're supposed to. Right? But that's where we're at. Okay? Is everyone okay with that idea? Okay? Because I know you get told and you hear in the media all the time that the Catholic Church hates the idea of religion. That is, nothing could be further from the truth. Okay? Catholic Church totally supports the idea. Okay? It is well explained. Okay? It helps to explain the whole idea of creation and the history of the earth. Now, if you're a fundamentalist, okay, a fundamentalist is a person who believes in the literal truth of the Bible. You'll hate everything I said, and that's okay. Okay? That's okay. Everybody's entitled to their beliefs. Okay? There are fundamentalist Catholics who would hate what I just said, and that's okay. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. Right? But this is how the Catholic Church in general, okay, explains all of this. Okay. All right. So, multicellularity. The first organisms on Earth, the first life on Earth was obviously single cell. Okay? It was cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, basically. Very simple bacteria that could carry out photosynthesis. Lots of groups of organisms diverged from that single organism. Okay? The plants came from that single organism, the animals came from that single organism, the protists, the fungi, okay? The monorans, all the 5 kingdoms came from that single organism. But some of those groups actually developed multicellularity. That is, groups of cells began to live together and share jobs. Okay? Now, sharing jobs is great. It's division, it's like, we'll all do a little bit of this job, we'll all do a little bit of that job. It's nice in that it makes life easier for everybody, but it doesn't get any of the jobs done really well. Everybody in a group, in a colonial organism where all the cells are the same, are still doing all the jobs. There's still a jack of all trades and a master of none. Okay? So it means they do everything okay, but they don't do anything particularly well. In a true multicellular organism, there's specialization. What that means is, in that group of cells, cell A became really good at doing this job, and cell B became really good at doing this job, and so on and so on. And eventually, you've got groups of cells that are performing one function particularly well, and are supported by the other groups of cells that are doing the jobs they don't do very well. And now you've got a bunch of masters of things and very few generalists. And that means things get done better and more efficiently. And we know that that's better because multicellularity, once it evolved, resulted in an explosion of life. Okay? Multicellular organisms were able to basically take over, okay, from single-celled organisms. Okay, so the 3 groups of life that ended up becoming multicellular and surviving through to the present day are the plants, so kingdom Plantae, kingdom Animalia, the animals, okay, and kingdom Fungi, so all the fungus. Okay, those are the 3 groups of multicellular organisms that have survived to the present day. Okay, there were other groups of multicellular organisms that we have seen in the fossil record that did not survive to the present day. Okay. All right, so here's kind of the history of Earth, diagrammatic. Okay, so I'm going to kind of explain how this diagram works so you get an idea of the timeline, okay, because the timeline is important. It helps to illustrate just how quickly multicellular organisms took over. Okay? So this blue line here on the diagram, okay, that gets wider as the diagram goes, represents the diversity of life on Earth. The number of different kinds of organisms that are alive on Earth at any given time. Okay? So if we go back, way back in the Earth's history, okay, to 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth has formed, its gravity is pulling in countless meteorites, okay? As the molten crust cools, oceans condense, but there is no place for life, or no place for life yet. Okay, so that's the earliest that we know the Earth to be this solid ball. Okay, 4.6 billion years ago. How do we know that? The oldest rocks we've ever found on Earth are 4.6 billion years old. Okay, that's the oldest rocks that we have found. So we assume that's when it all started. Okay, now, during this time, there's still a lot of meteors, still a lot of crap floating around in the solar system that can hit us. Okay? In fact, this period of time is known as the late heavy bombardment. Okay? It would imply getting hit a lot. Okay? So, it makes it tough for life to kind of get a foothold because every time life kind of gets going, something big smashes into the Earth. Okay? And as we've seen in the Earth's history, that's generally bad, okay, for life on Earth. Right? But about 3.9 to 3.5 billion years ago, okay, we see the first life appear in the fossil record. These little cyanobacteria, these little photosynthetic algae, okay, they appear. All right, so the Earth is actually here for anywhere between 500 million and 1 billion years before life appears. Okay? So like 1/5 of the Earth's history is lifeless. Right? But it took a long time for the Earth to cool, oceans to become cool enough to support life, okay? Or for the atmosphere to become like clear enough that sunlight could reach the surface and power photosynthesis. Okay, so life originates as single-celled organisms, okay, and the dominant atmospheric gas is actually carbon dioxide at this point. Okay, so the Earth's atmosphere is nothing like it is today at the point we're at here, 3.5 billion years ago. So the Earth's atmosphere is full of ammonia and carbon dioxide, which is why a photosynthetic organism would do very, very well. There's tons of food, okay? There's sunlight, there's water, and there's carbon dioxide.
Wasn't there also cells that were living way further down in the ocean?
There is some evidence that there were chemoheterotrophs. Yes, we still have chemoheterotrophs, or sorry, chemoautotrophs living near volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. Okay? But they are very, in the fossil record, a very small percentage of what we have found. Okay. Yes. All right. So what are photosynthetic organisms producing as a waste product now? Oxygen. Okay. So the only thing that's alive on Earth are photosynthetic organisms. They have no predators. What's going to happen if there's nothing to control the population of something? Yeah, it'll explode. Okay, you get exponential growth. Okay, and it just goes and goes and goes. Well, this is great until you've got so many organisms living that their waste products begin to accumulate. The waste product being oxygen. Everything that's alive on Earth at this point evolved in a carbon dioxide rich environment, and there reaches a tipping point. Okay? And that tipping point is oxygen becomes so high in concentration that it actually becomes toxic to almost all life on Earth. Okay? And it literally is a tipping point. Everything's doing fine, and then all of a sudden, bang, almost everything on Earth dies. Because it gets poisoned by its own waste. Okay? Oxygen. There are some organisms that can tolerate this higher oxygen. They survive. Okay? That's natural selection. They reproduce, they repopulate, okay? And we start seeing organisms starting to change. It usually takes something like a mass extinction in order to cause a lot of changes and adaptations to show up. Okay? So 2.8 to 2.1 billion years ago or so, okay, we're starting to get ice caps forming. Having all that carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere causes an ice age. Because carbon dioxide, as we all know, is a greenhouse gas. Okay? And if you remove it from the atmosphere, the temperature drops. Okay? So that causes some problems for a lot of the organisms living. They kind of grew up in a nice warm soup, okay, that they were in. Okay? And so that's going to change. But we start getting single-celled organisms that are more complex. Okay? And then we start getting eukaryotic cells. So cells that aren't bacteria anymore. We start seeing cells that have a nuclei, and they have a mitochondria, and they have all of this stuff. Okay? And once that happens, multicellular organisms can appear. Now, they're all very simple, okay? Simple multicellular organisms, but they're there. Okay? That's about 1.9 billion years ago. So large single-celled organisms appear, and multicelled-like organisms. Not true multicellular, but multicelled-like. Okay? So that would be colonies of cells that are identical. So now, about 1 billion years ago or so, okay, is right about here. Okay? This is kind of where the first true multicellular organisms appear in the fossil record. Okay? Once that happens, look what happens to the thickness of that line. Okay, 1 billion years ago, okay, that's the start of multicellular organisms. Look what happens to the line. Okay, it goes from being really thin to taking up the whole picture. Because once multicellularity evolved, it was able to take over the planet. It was able to adapt, fill niches, okay, stuff like that, okay, and it was just able to take over. So we see all of this stuff. This was known as the Cambrian explosion. Okay, literally means the diversity of life just popped, and it was kind of everywhere after that. Now we're still looking at, the pre-Cambrian, Cambrian boundaries right here. So the Cambrian explosion, that's 540 million years ago. At this point, there's still nothing alive on land. Okay, so this is still everything lives in the ocean. Right? Stuff didn't come out on the land until about 400 million years ago, and those would have been just plants. okay? And then, shortly thereafter, about 250, okay, or so, you get your first animals coming out onto land and so on, right? Which is a whole other explosion, okay? Notice I said whole other. Don't ever say whole nother, because that's not a word. Whole nother thing, then it's not a word. Whole other or another, those words. Okay, does everyone kind of follow how that process goes? Okay, so just so you get kind of a perspective, multicellularity was a huge competitive advantage over being single cell. Okay? If you're single celled, you can only get so big. That limits your food, it limits your habitat, all of that kind of stuff. Becoming multicellular overcame that. And the most important thing it overcame was something we talked about yesterday: surface area to volume ratio. Okay? We said that as a single cell gets big, its ability to transport material by diffusion decreases. Becoming multicellular overcomes that problem. Okay? And it allowed organisms to get big. Being big is generally an advantage. Like during 99% of the fossil record, being bigger was better. Okay? The only time it wasn't, like end of the Cretaceous period, basically. Okay? So being bigger was better because you could eat more things and fewer things could eat you. Okay? So bigger was generally better. And multicellular organisms were going to be bigger. All right. So the big thing here, and this is like the most important part of this whole lesson, what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells, that's a colony of cells, okay, is the division of labor, which is also known as specialization. Okay, so what distinguishes a multicellular organism from a colony of cells is division of labor among cells, differing in structure and function. Okay, you can summarize all of that as specialization. Okay, so looking at this organism here, this is not a true multicellular organism because all the cells are identical. So they all perform all jobs. Okay, they would all collect food. They would all process that food. They would all burn sugar for energy. They would all contribute to movement, protection, all of that kind of stuff. But they would all do it equally. So that is a colony or an aggregate organism. Okay, it is not a true multicellular organism. Okay, so the evolution of multicellular organisms involved increasing cellular specialization, so more and more and more. The first multicellular organisms were like a sponge. Okay, so if you've ever seen like a real living sponge, not the kind that you buy at the dollar store that's yellow and has the green abrasive part on the back, okay, that's not a real sponge, it's a fake one. But you can actually buy real sponges for washing stuff. Okay, the sponge is a true multicellular organism, but it's very simple. There are some different cells, but there are no real tissues. Okay, so the difference between like a sponge and a more complex multicellular organism is a sponge has cells that do different jobs, but they're not necessarily grouped together. Okay, you and I have tissues, that is groups of cells that are together doing a single job. Tissues make up organs. Organs make up systems. Systems make up an organism. Okay, so if I'm looking at that, we could say that there are different types of tissue in the liver. Okay, but the liver generally has cells that are specialized to clean blood. Okay, your heart has lots of specialized cells that are designed to contract and relax, and basically never rest. Okay, and be able to pump your blood for your entire life. Okay, they're specialized to do a certain job, and they're all together. I don't have a heart cell out here in my finger, another one on my knee. Okay, that wouldn't work very well. But that's like what a sponge is. Okay? In fact, a sponge is so simple that you can push it through a sieve, like through a screen, and it'll go back together on the other side, like the Terminator. Because it's not made of tissues. The cells are all separate. So you could literally take it, put it on the screen, go squish, and push it right through until it was like completely annihilated, and on the other side it would go back together. Wouldn't look the same, okay, but it would survive. It's crazy but true. Okay? So it's not, it's specialized, it's multicellular, but it's not very complex. Okay? All right. What are some things that look odd about these pictures?
The size of the moon.
Size of the moon. Why does the moon look so big in these pictures?
Is it because it had just recently made contact with the Earth, so it wasn't far out in orbit?
Yes, sort of. Not so much that it had just made contact, but it had just formed. Okay? The moon came from the Earth. Okay? Very, very early on in Earth's history, like that 4.6 billion year mark, Earth was hit by a Mars-sized object, okay, called Theia. And that impact annihilated the impactor, okay, and basically re-liquefied the Earth's surface, which was starting to cool. So if anything had evolved to live on Earth before that point, there's no record of it, because the Earth's surface was completely molten again, okay, and would have destroyed any fossils. So this impact, when it happened, okay, was not like a head-on collision. Okay? It was more of like a glancing blow. So this object, which was about the size of Mars, so 1/3 of Earth, okay, hits the Earth like this. Okay? When it hits the Earth like this, the Earth is like not destroyed. It's not going to come apart, but it's re-liquefied. And much of the impactor is absorbed by the Earth, like the core and things like that would be absorbed. But the surface of the Earth and the surface of the impactor, okay, are thrown in a cloud of debris. So this impactor goes from being this object to being a cloud of debris, okay, that's around the Earth. Well, that cloud of debris, because of gravity, starts to collect. And it starts to collect fairly quickly, and I say quickly in the geological sense, like, you know, a few million years, okay, and forms the moon. But because of the fact that it was formed by an impact, the debris cloud is very close to the Earth when it forms. So the moon used to be a lot closer to the Earth than it is now. So early on, after the moon had formed, it was so close to the Earth, it would go around the Earth every 6 hours. How long does it take the moon to go around the Earth now? Yeah, just a little over 28 days. Okay? So the Earth and the moon have gotten a lot further apart over time. And they're actually continuing to get further apart by a mind-boggling 2.5 centimeters a year. Okay? I know that doesn't seem like much, but do that over 4.6 billion years, it adds up. Okay? And of course, earlier on, that may have been bigger, and the rates may have been bigger. So if you can imagine the moon rising and setting over the Earth a whole bunch of times in a day, okay, as opposed to once. Okay? The moon only rises and sets once a day for us because we rotate underneath it. Okay? This thing would have risen and set because it was going around the Earth so fast. Now, what does the moon cause on Earth? Tides. Okay? Because the ocean is fluid, the moon's gravity actually pulls the fluid towards it. So as the moon goes around the Earth, and the Earth actually rotates underneath it, different parts of the ocean face the moon, and they get pulled towards the moon, which is why we get several tides a day, high and low, okay? Because of what's happening with the Earth and the moon. Okay? Now imagine how big those tides would have been when the moon was this far away, as opposed to what it is today, which is like way out here somewhere. Okay? Would they have been a lot bigger? Anyone ever been to the Bay of Fundy on the East Coast in Nova Scotia? It's where the biggest tides in the world are. Okay? You might have seen pictures of it where they show like a boat floating next to a dock, and then they show that same boat sitting on the ground. Okay? the tides in the Bay of Fundy can go out like almost a kilometer, right? I know this because I went there and I actually followed the tide out one day. I would just walk with the ocean that went away, okay? And that was a mistake because I almost didn't make it back because, well, the ground is saturated, it's really muddy, and you don't make very good speed when you're trying to walk through the mud that's up to your knees when the tide decides it's coming back. Like I was like pretty much swimming for the last little bit, which was easier than walking in the mud. But yeah, so the tides in some places on Earth go in and out a lot. But if you can imagine when the moon was that close, the ocean would have gone in and out several kilometers, okay, each and every day. Like we get upset when a tidal wave happens and a couple of coastal cities get wet. Okay, imagine what the tides would have been. Okay, it would have been like, all right, the ocean's going to go from where it is right now and swallow up all the coastal cities. So like basically all of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and get like halfway into Ontario, and then go out again. Okay, and it would go out that far. So there'd be like a whole bunch of kind of half dry, soaking wet mud. Well, that environment is perfect for life to evolve. It's constantly getting an influx of nutrients. Every time the tides come in, all this stuff just gets deposited there. Okay? Then the tide goes out, and you got nice bright sunshine to do your photosynthesis. And the ocean comes back in. Okay? So that was the environment in which the first life on Earth evolved. It was really important that the moon did that. Okay? Now, in addition to that, the Earth spun around a lot faster then too. Okay? As the moon gets further away, the rotation, the spinning of the Earth actually slows. Eventually, the moon will leave, and the Earth will become tidally locked to the sun. That means the same side of it will face the sun all the time. We need to be gone by then, or we'll be gone by then.
What time are we talking?
Oh, we're talking billions of years. Nothing you need to worry about right now. It's not happening tomorrow. It's not happening 100 years from now. It's nothing mankind should have to worry about, because if we haven't figured out how to get off this planet by the time that happens, we deserve to go.
What's pulling the moon away?
Its own inertia, actually. Remember that it formed as a result of something that was trying to go past the Earth. When it hit the Earth, it threw the debris into orbit, but the Earth's gravity kind of caught it, but not enough to keep it. So it's slowly going away. It's going a little too fast to stay in orbit. Okay? And if you look at actually most of the moons that we at least have any ability to study, okay, there's a tendency of that. Mars has the 2 captured asteroid moons. One of them is falling into Mars and the other is going to flee. Okay? One's going too fast, the other's going too slow. Okay? And that's the nature of moons. You very rarely find a moon that has a perfect. Okay, so that would have happened, okay, kind of early on. That's why the moon looks so big in a lot of these pictures. It was really big. It was a lot closer. Okay? And so the tidal flats would have been much different. And you notice that in a lot of these pictures, there's volcanoes. Remember, the Earth's a lot younger. Its crust isn't nearly as thick. It hasn't had as much time to cool as it has now. Okay? So volcanic eruptions are far more common. Right? That represents, obviously, disruptions. It could block sunlight. Okay? It's going to put pollutants in the air, but pollutants can also be nutrients. Okay? So there's kind of a balance there with whether volcanoes are destructive or constructive. And there's lots of meteors in these pictures, because again, early on, we know that period of time to be the late heavy bombardment where, yeah, the Earth got hit a lot. Chris Rock, kind of like that. All right, but like more. He only got hit once. The Earth got hit a lot more than that. Maybe that's too soon. He shouldn't have got hit. That was ridiculous. All right. So let's take a quick break here, like 2 minutes, and then I'm going to talk about some specialized cells within the plant. So the example of a multicellular organism for us in Science 10 is going to be the plant. So you're not going to be dissecting any animals or anything like that in Science 10. Okay? Our example of the multicellular organism will be a vascular plant. Okay? Vascular plants are the plants that have tubes. So basically anything that's not a moss, okay, or an algae would be a vascular plant. Okay? So within the vascular plant, okay, and we're just going to skip this stuff here, okay, there are groups of cells. The best example of specialization is the leaf. Okay, so you're going to see the diagram of the leaf in this class a whole bunch of times. And it's actually what we looked at under the microscope for the cell anatomy lab. Okay? Now you might have noticed that not all the cells looked the same when you looked at that slide, because it looked something like this. You had a bunch of those rectangular cells, the ones I told you you should make sure you do your labeling of these, and then underneath that were some kind of more irregularly shaped cells. On the very top were cells that looked hollow, okay? And on the bottom, same thing. There's all kinds of specialization there, different groups of cells that do different jobs, okay? There has never been a unit exam where I did not use a diagram of the leaf as a question about what it is to be multicellular, okay? Being able to explain to me, here in the leaf are specialized cells. These cells are specialized to do this. These cells are specialized to do this, and that's what makes a true multicellular organism, okay? I always ask that question with a diagram of the leaf on the unit exam. I really wish a lot more of you had written that down. I'm telling you one of the questions and how to answer it on the unit exam, okay? Anytime you hear me say, I always ask this, you should write it down. Okay? Always. All right, so within the cell, within the leaf, sorry, okay, there are these different groups of cells, right? On the very top and on the very bottom of the leaf, okay, are the cells of the epidermis. Okay, so epidermis is basically outer covering. Our skin is our epidermis. The epidermal cells of the leaf have one job. Their job is to secrete a waxy substance that coats and seals the leaf, called the cuticle. Okay, so the job of the epidermal cells is to secrete the cuticle. The cuticle seals the leaf so that evaporation cannot occur through the leaf. Okay, so it essentially seals the leaf tight so that it cannot lose water from the entire surface of the leaf. You may have noticed that when dew collects on a leaf, that it beads and then runs off. The leaf doesn't actually absorb water that hits it. Okay? It falls off of the leaf and is absorbed by the roots, which are specialized to absorb water. Okay? They're another example of specialized tissue. Okay, from the top now, okay, underneath the epidermal cells is what's called the palisade layer. That's the layer you had to label in the cell anatomy lab. The palisade cells are packed tight together. Okay, so if you've ever ridden the C train during rush hour, it's like the people on the train. Okay, they're just packed in like sardines. Okay, they're packed really close together, and they have very regular shape. Okay, kind of rectangular, because that allows them to be packed more densely. They're also full of chloroplasts, more so than any other group of cells. Because what do you suppose their job is, being on the top of the leaf? Photosynthesis, yeah. Okay? They're the top layer. The epidermis is transparent, so the light gets through it no problem. It strikes the palisade layer, and the palisade layer's job is to carry out photosynthesis. It feeds the rest of the plant. Okay? That layer of cells, right there on the top of the leaf. Okay? So right here. Okay? And right here. So this top layer, okay, of cells, that feeds the plant. Okay. Underneath the palisade layer is what we call the spongy layer. Okay. And the spongy layer can still carry out some photosynthesis, but it's not really its main job. The cells are irregularly shaped, which means they don't fit tightly together. There's space in between the cells. And what sits in that space is water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. It is this layer that allows the exchange of materials that allows photosynthesis to take place. Okay? So water gets brought into the spongy layer by the xylem, which we'll talk about later. It's water transporting tissue. Okay? And carbon dioxide comes in through the stomates, these little cells that we're going to talk about in a minute, okay, that are specialized to open and close and allow water to evaporate, carbon dioxide and oxygen to be exchanged. Okay? right? So all of that comes into the spongy layer. So the spongy layer basically stores the materials, water, carbon dioxide, that the palisade layer needs to carry out photosynthesis. Okay, so this is like demand, supply. Okay. Underneath the spongy layer is another epidermal layer. Okay? The bottom of the leaf also has to be sealed in a waxy cuticle. But the bottom epidermal layer isn't a tight seal everywhere. There are stomates, which are like pores. And they can open and close because they're made of two specialized cells called guard cells. Okay? And these guard cells, their water vacuoles can fill and empty very quickly. Right? When in the morning, their water vacuoles are very, very full. And so the shape of the stomate, okay, looks like this. Okay? So these are our guard cells on either side, okay? And their water vacuoles are very full. So they're shaped like a bean, and the stomate is open. Oxygen, carbon dioxide can exchange, water can evaporate. Throughout the day, as water evaporates, salt builds up in the spongy layer. And if there's salt there, what cellular transport process is going to happen? Osmosis. Okay? If salt starts to build up in the spongy layer, then water will leave the guard cells by osmosis and go to the spongy layer. When that happens, the guard cells don't have enough turgor pressure to maintain their bean shape and keep the stomates open. So they get weak and they close. Okay? It all happens passively. The plant has no control over that process, but it works perfectly. When would a plant need to control evaporation? As it's losing water. What causes the stomates to close? Loss of water. Okay? So it works perfectly, even if it is a passive process. So the plant doesn't just make a conscious decision, because obviously it's a plant and they don't make conscious decisions. But they don't just go, oh, well, I've got to close the stomate, it's getting too hot outside. Okay? That just naturally happens. Right? So that's another example of specialized cells. I also always ask about stomates and guard cells, which I'll talk more about tomorrow. Okay? When we start talking about parts of the plant.